Snow drifted across Frostala Ridge with the soft determination of a memory returning. Each flake a quiet reminder of things the world once forgot. At dawn, the wind moved like an old storyteller through the bare-limbed aspens, brushing their branches against the sides of the wooden auction barn as though urging them to speak. Inside, where lantern light pooled in honey-colored circles on the dirt floor, the injured police dog lay shivering in a narrow wire cage. His name Ash was spoken only once before the auction began, and even that single utterance felt too heavy for the cold morning air. He lifted his head when boots scraped nearby. His breath came in warm, uneven puffs. A strip of bandage wrapped around his leg was stained a faint rust color, and the fur along his ribs thinned into the contours of suffering. Each sound, the creak of a board overhead, the mutter of distant voices made him flinch ever so slightly, as if the world had trained him to expect pain before peace. People walked past him without stopping. A few took a curious glance, but most looked away, perhaps uncomfortable with the shape of a creature who had given everything and been left with nothing. Jonas Pike. The auction runner strode by briskly, his coat swaying behind him like a whip of dark canvas. He barely spared the dog a look. "Nobody's going to want that one," he muttered to another man, loud enough to be overheard. "Broken things don't fetch much." Ash lowered his head. If a dog could understand the weight of human dismissal, it was in the slow settling of his body against the straw, a surrender carved by days of judgment. The morning's quiet was broken by the soft crunch of snow outside, a rhythmic sound that grew steadily louder until the barn door groaned open. Elias Crowder slipped inside with the winter clinging to him. Snowflakes clung to the loose strands of his dark hair and melted into the worn fabric of his coat. He carried himself with a modesty that suggested he was always trying not to disturb the spaces he stepped into. People shifted subtly when they saw him, forming invisible borders. The quiet stranger from the cabin by the frozen Crecan outsider, among people who disliked being reminded of their own loneliness. He didn't look around or acknowledge the stares. Instead, his gaze found Ash almost immediately. As if the world had narrowed into a path between one wounded soul and another. Elias walked slowly, not wanting to frighten him. He knelt beside the cage and rested one hand lightly on the cold metal. Ash did not growl. He simply looked up with tired golden eyes, something unspoken passing between them like a fragile thread stretched across emptiness. Elias whispered, "You've seen hard days, haven't you?" His voice was soft, shaped by winters harsher than this one, and somehow it reached past the dog's fear. Ash's ears twitched. A tiny shift hope, or maybe just the memory of it. A few feet away, Mara Winthorne arranged bags of feed on a table, stealing glances at the stranger and the dog. Winter had painted her cheeks a gentle rose. Her eyes held the stillness of someone who had learned to hide her tenderness in plain sight. She had worked in the town's feed store for years, and she knew every face within Frostala Ridge, except Elias. He carried secrets like a man, carries old injuries quietly. Without complaint, she watched the way he knelt, the way his hand stayed still and patient on the cage, and felt something shift in her chest. Not recognition, more like a quiet ache that understood another quiet ache. Sheriff Calder Boone stepped inside with the stomp of authority. His uniform was dusted with frost, and his eyes were tired with the burden of reputation. "Crowder," he called, voice echoing slightly against the rafters. "Didn't expect to see you here." His gaze drifted to Ash. "Dog's no use to anyone now. Shame, really. Saved a child once, but saving don't keep a creature from wearing out." Elias didn't answer. He simply lowered his gaze a little, as though the sheriff's words brushed against an old bruise inside him. Boone shook his head, a gesture half pity, half dismissal, and moved on. Mara's hands tightened on a feed bag. The sheriff's tone pricked something inside her, but she stayed silent. Frostala Ridge was a place where silence was easier than speaking, especially when you lived alone in a small room, above a store, and felt grateful anyone remembered your name. Jonas climbed onto a low platform, clapped his hands, and called everyone's attention. The auction began with tools, crates, old farm gear. People bid with casual competitiveness, coins clinking, boots thudding on wood, but the air shifted when Ash's turn approached. as if the barn itself braced for discomfort. "Next up," Jonas announced. "Lot 32. Retired police dog, injured. Temperament uncertain." His voice had a cold efficiency, as though reading off the flaws of a piece of damaged equipment. "Opening bid, $10. Silence rolled through the barn like a slow-moving fog. Ash stood on trembling legs, ears pinned back. His breath fogged against the cold wire. He seemed to understand that this was a judgment, and he was losing. "Come on now," Jonas insisted. "He's trained. Loyal once. Surely someone wants a guard dog, even a limping one." No one moved. A man in a fur-lined coat scoffed. "He's a risk. Liability." A woman muttered, "My hens are worth more than that." Another voice spoke softly, "Poor creature." "But I can't feed another mouth." Elias felt the humiliation in the air sharp, like the sting of winter wind against raw skin. It reminded him too strongly of nights spent on hilltops alone. Listening to the world pretend it didn't see the shape of him, Ash stared at the ground. His tail lowered until it nearly brushed the straw. Mara exhaled, breath trembling. "Someone," she whispered, though no one heard, "please." Jonas glanced around impatiently. $10. Going once. He paused for effect, irritation flashing in his eyes. Going twice, a hand rose. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't slice the air in some bold, heroic gesture. Elias Crowder's hand simply lifted, steady and quiet. Like a man choosing to breathe after holding it too long, the barn froze. Whispers fluttered like startled birds. "That drifter? He can't afford to feed himself. I'll never handle that dog." Sheriff Boone sighed heavily and stepped closer. "Crowder, think carefully. This dog's seen things most of us haven't. He's unpredictable." Elias didn't look away. "I know," he said quietly. Mara felt warmth bloom in her chest, fragile and bright. She'd never heard him speak longer than a sentence before, and something about the steady simplicity of those two words made her blink back a sudden sting of emotion. Jonas raised a brow. "Any competing bids?" Silence met him again. "All right then. Sold to Elias Crowder." The gavel struck the wooden stump with a dull, decisive thud. Elias rose slowly, wiped snowmelt from his coat sleeve, and approached the cage. His fingers moved gently as he unlatched the door, and Ash, after a hesitant pause, stepped forward. His injured leg trembled, but he stayed upright. Elias placed a hand on the dog's shoulder, steadying him. Ash leaned into the touch. The crowd watched with a mixture of disbelief and discomfort. As if witnessing something private and sacred and not knowing whether they were supposed to turn away, Mara found herself stepping slightly closer, drawn by a quiet gravity. Her breath frosted the air as she whispered, barely audible, "Thank you." Elias didn't look at her, but a small shift crossed his expression, something softening, something thawing. Together, man and dog walked across the barn, their footsteps slow but sure. Ash limped. Elias matched his pace, adjusting so subtly it looked like a natural rhythm rather than an accommodation. The winter lights spilled through the open doorway, washing them in a pale silver glow. Outside, snow drifted down in gentle spirals, covering the frozen ground like a blanket meant to protect rather than bury. Elias paused on the threshold, his hand resting lightly on Ash's back. The dog leaned into him again, seeking warmth. For the first time in days, perhaps longer, Ash's tail lifted just an inch. It was not triumph. It was not transformation, but it was a beginning. And as they stepped into the soft white morning, every watching heart felt, if only briefly, the faint stir of a story not yet finished. One that seemed to whisper through the cold air, "Keep going. There is more to come." Winter laid its heavy hand over Frosella Ridge in the days after the auction, pressing silence into every hollow and drifting snow across the creek cabin where Elias Crowder lived. The cabin itself was small, a weathered shelter tucked among pines bowed under white weight. But inside, warmth pulsed from a modest fire that snapped with the soft confidence of a thing doing its best. Ash lay curled on a wool blanket near the hearth, his injured legs stretched awkwardly in front of him. The flames reflected in his eyes, brightening the dim gold there. as if reminding him his story had not ended in that cold barn. Elias knelt beside him, wiping a damp cloth gently along the dog's bandages. Each motion was deliberate, slow, and careful. The kind of care a man gives only when he understands too intimately what it means to be hurt. Ash flinched at first, but soon his body softened under the touch, his breaths expanding with a little more ease each time Elias whispered, "Easy, boy. You're all right." Outside, the wind carried the low moan of a rising storm across the valley. Frostallow Ridge had seen countless winters, but this one felt particularly solemn, as though the sky itself grieved for something unnamed. Elias listened to the wind, the fire, and the soft rhythm of Ash's breathing. The cabin felt less empty now. Not full but less hollow, like placing a single candle in a vast room. Mara Winthorne arrived the next afternoon with a parcel wrapped in cloth and tied with twine. Snow clung to the hem of her coat and sparkled in her hair like tiny fallen stars. Elias opened the door halfway, surprised to see her standing there. She looked equally surprised that she had found the courage to come. "I brought salve," she said, lifting the parcel. "For his leg, and some dried meat." Her breath clouded between them. "If that's all right," Elias stepped aside. "You're always welcome." Her boots clicked softly on the wooden floor as she entered. She crouched beside Ash, who lifted his head and sniffed her hand. His tail moved once, shy as a secret. Mara smiled, brushing her fingers through the dog's fur. "Good boy," she murmured, and the tenderness in her voice filled the small cabin like a warm draft. Elias watched her with an expression that hovered between gratitude and uncertainty. He wasn't used to kindness that expected nothing in return. Mara sensed his hesitation, so she didn't linger. After applying the salve with practiced gentleness, she rose and gave him a small nod. "I'll check in tomorrow. If you want, I'd—" "Like that," Elias said, surprising himself with the sincerity in his tone. Word of her visit drifted through town faster than the storm approaching. Frostallow Ridge was a place where gossip settled more easily than snow. By the third day, whispers sharpened into opinions. People questioned why Mara bothered with a drifter and a broken dog. Sheriff Boone remarked to someone outside the general store that risking kindness on that situation was unwise. Each careless word drifted eventually back to Elias, carried like frozen ash on the wind. He tried to ignore it. Ash, however, sensed the tension. Dogs like him, trained for danger, scarred by service, felt human emotion as if it were weather. When Elias returned from town with shoulders heavy from judgment, Ash would rise, limping forward to lean his weight gently against the man's knee. It was a silent comfort, a wordless promise that neither had to endure their loneliness alone. The storm growing across the ridge arrived without mercy one night. Rolling down the mountain in a torrent of white that swallowed the world, snow battered the cabin windows, rattling them in their frames. The wind howled like a wounded creature. Ash paced in circles, ears twitching, breath quickening to anxious bursts. Memories weighed on him, shadows of sirens, gunfire, the night that had torn his trust in the world apart. Elias knelt beside him, placing both hands on the dog's shoulders. "I'm here," he whispered. "You're safe." Thunderous gusts shook the cabin walls. A branch thudded onto the roof. Ash pressed his head against Elias's chest, trembling. The man held him tightly, firelight flickering across their silhouettes as if stitching them together with strands of gold, then dashed beneath the wailing storm. Came a desperate pounding on the cabin door. Elias rose cautiously. Ash followed, limping yet alert. When the door swung open, snow burst inside like an invading wave. Sheriff Boone stumbled in, face flushed with panic, snow crusting his beard. His breaths came in ragged heaves. "Rowan's missing," he said. "My nephew. Went out to feed the hens before the storm hit. Full force hasn't come back. We can't see 10 feet in front of us, Elias." His voice cracked, raw and frightened. "We need the dog." Ash stepped forward before Elias could answer. His ears pricked, nose lifting to catch what little scent seeped through the open door. Snowflakes clung to his whiskers. In his gaze flickered purpose, the old training rising like embers stirred by wind. "You don't owe them," Elias said softly, kneeling once more. Snow swirled behind him, a wild curtain of white. "Not after everything. You don't have to go out there." Ash looked at him, eyes steady, resolute. Then he leaned forward and pressed his muzzle into Ilias's palm, not asking permission, giving reassurance. Elias closed his eyes briefly. "All right," he whispered. "We'll go." Lantern in hand, cloak wrapped tight, he stepped outside with Ash at his side. The storm swallowed them immediately. Snow roared against their faces, stinging skin like shards of ice. The world dissolved into a whiteness so thick it nearly erased the ground beneath their boots. Ash lowered his head, sniffing through the wind. Each inhale a battle against the cold. Elias followed the dog's lead, trusting without question. He could barely see Ash's dark form in front of him, but the dog moved with certainty, guided by instinct older than fear. They trudged through drifts that rose past their knees, their breaths turning to frost in the air. The lantern flickered violently, its light a fragile heartbeat in the storm. After what felt like hours, though, time meant little in the white void. Ash stopped. He raised his head, ears darting, and took off toward a cluster of fallen pines. Elias scrambled after him, slipping on ice, lungs burning. A faint cry pierced the roaring wind. Then another. They found Rowan half buried in snow, huddled beneath a broken pine branch, face pale with cold. His small hands trembled uncontrollably. "Uncle, I couldn't." "Find the path," he whispered, voice thin as thread. Ash pushed close to the boy, curling around him to share what warmth he had left. Elias wrapped the child in his cloak, lifting him with effort. The storm raged harder now, as if fighting to keep them, but Ash stood firm, barking once a sharp, determined sound before leading the way back. The journey home was a battle fought step by step. Elias staggered under the child's weight. Ash limped, but did not falter. The lantern nearly died twice, but through the swirling white, the cabin finally emerged like a memory refusing to be forgotten. Sheriff Boone and several townsfolk rushed out when they saw shapes approaching through the storm. Relief cracked Boone's stern features when he saw the boy alive, bundled against Ilias's chest. Mara appeared behind them, eyes wide with fear that softened into tears when Ash limped into her arms. She knelt, holding the dog's face between her palms. "You brave, beautiful boy," she whispered, voice trembling. The townspeople stared at Elias and Ash with a silence unlike any they'd shown before, not judgment. Word spread quickly through Frostalla Ridge, reshaping every cold opinion. Warming old prejudices, melting them like winter, surrendering to spring. Elias watched the transformation quietly. He didn't crave praise. He only cared that Ash, though exhausted, lifted his head proudly and leaned against Mara's hands. The dog's trust, hard-won and fragile, felt like a gift greater than gratitude. Later, when the storm calmed and stars returned to the sky, Leah stepped outside with Ash and Mara beside him. Snow gleamed under moonlight, turning the world into a canvas of silver and stillness. Mara slipped her hand into Ilias's, not boldly, not dramatically, but with the gentle certainty of someone choosing warmth over solitude. He didn't speak, but his fingers curled around hers in return. Ash sat between them, gaze soft, breath calm, his body finally at peace. Elias looked up at the wide, quiet sky, then down at the dog who had saved a child and, in doing so, saved the man who believed himself beyond redemption. Some stories, he realized, were not shouted but whispered, carried from heart to heart like small flames. And though the night held its silence, it also held promise, glowing faintly through the cold. If you felt this whispered tale settle gently inside you, stay close, subscribe, and let the warmth of these stories find you again.